During the storm of World War II, few European nations managed to avoid the battlefield. Portugal, under the authoritarian leadership of António de Oliveira Salazar, was one of them. While bombs fell across Europe and empires collapsed, Portugal maintained a delicate balance of neutrality, maneuvering carefully between the Allied and Axis powers. Salazar's ability to preserve his country's peace and sovereignty in such a turbulent time was both a diplomatic triumph and a reflection of Portugal's unique geopolitical position. Salazar and the Estado Novo. António de Oliveira Salazar, the conservative dictator of Portugal from 1932 to 1968, governed through an authoritarian regime known as the Estado Novo, New State. It emphasized order, Catholic values, corporatism, and anti-communism. Salazar, though ideologically conservative and sympathetic to some aspects of fascism, had no desire to entangle Portugal in a world war that could destroy his fragile state and colonial empire. Having witnessed the devastation of World War I and the chaos of the Spanish Civil War on his doorstep, Salazar prioritized stability and national survival over ideological adventure. An old alliance, a new dilemma. One of the cornerstones of Portugal's diplomatic strategy was the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, the oldest still functioning alliance in the world, dating back to 1386. Although this bond tied Portugal historically to Britain, Salazar was cautious not to provoke Nazi Germany, especially early in the war when Hitler's forces seemed unstoppable. Instead of choosing sides outright, Portugal declared a policy of strict neutrality in 1939. However, as the war evolved, so did Portugal's approach, shifting from neutrality to what historians often call collaborative neutrality. Economic and strategic balancing. Portugal walked a tightrope. On one hand, it traded tungsten, wolfram, a critical metal used in weapons manufacturing, with Nazi Germany. This trade was a key source of revenue, but also placed Portugal in the crosshairs of Allied frustration, especially from Britain and the United States. On the other hand, Salazar allowed the Allies access to vital strategic assets. Most notably, in 1943, Portugal permitted Britain and the U.S. to use air bases in the Azores. These islands were crucial for anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic, helping to protect Allied convoys from German U-boats. This decision greatly favored the Allies and marked a subtle but important shift in Portugal's posture. Humanitarian neutrality. Though authoritarian at home, Salazar's Portugal played a modest humanitarian role during the war. Lisbon became a hub of diplomacy and espionage, but also a refuge for thousands fleeing Nazi persecution. Portuguese diplomats, most famously Aristides de Sousa Mendes, issued visas to Jewish refugees, sometimes against the regime's orders, allowing many to escape occupied Europe via Portugal. Portugal's ports, trains, and shipping lanes served as critical exit points for refugees on their way to the Americas, especially after France fell in 1940. Why Salazar stayed out? Salazar's decision to maintain neutrality was driven by a blend of realpolitik and ideology. Military weakness. Portugal lacked the resources or military power to engage in a global conflict. Colonial preservation. Salazar was determined to protect Portugal's colonial empire in Africa and Asia. War would have made these vulnerable. Economic stability. Portugal's economy was underdeveloped and heavily reliant on trade with both sides. Remaining neutral ensured continued commerce and relative domestic calm. Diplomatic agility. Salazar feared Nazi expansion but had more to gain from long-term ties with Britain and the U.S. His cooperation over the Azores was rewarded with a post-war diplomatic rehabilitation. Aftermath and legacy. Portugal emerged from World War II physically untouched and economically intact. Its careful balancing act preserved national sovereignty, but it did little to modernize or democratize the country. Salazar's regime would continue for decades, isolated from the wave of post-war liberalism sweeping Europe. In 1945, Portugal joined the newly formed United Nations, and in 1949, it became a founding member of NATO, signaling its alignment with the West in the Cold War. Salazar's wartime neutrality thus paid dividends, keeping Portugal out of the war while positioning it well for the geopolitical realities that followed. Portugal's role in World War II was subtle, complex, and deeply strategic. Under Salazar's shrewd leadership, the country maintained a fragile neutrality that allowed it to survive the most destructive war in history with its territory intact, its regime preserved, and its global alliances ultimately reinforced. In a world of shifting powers and destroyed nations, Portugal's quiet survival was a remarkable feat of diplomacy.